I'm Lois.
I'm Barry.
And
we're the Einhorns.
Einhorns. And we are here today to welcome Rabbi Geller and you, the audience. We both are 91 years old and therefore members of the so-called silent generation, folks aged 76 to 96. Everyone is living 30 years longer than at the beginning of the 20th century. You have to plan early for the later stage of life, and that period can be 30 years or longer.
How do boomers who are in their 60s and 70s, and even Gen Xers who are in their 40s, prepare for their silent generation years? Before the pandemic arrived, we were extremely active seniors and were living and enjoying our life to its fullest. We volunteered regularly in the general community, the Jewish community, and became even more active in our synagogue. Our lifestyle helped us to be healthy and happy as we aged. Unfortunately, all of that's on hold now.
Rabbi Laura Geller and her late husband, Richard Siegel, wrote Getting Good at Getting Older, which we think is a definitive guide. Read and use this book, and you can be as happy as we are.
Right. Let me get my script. I lost it. Okay. Here. Thank you. Rabbi Geller is the fourth woman ordained as a rabbi in the United States. That's pretty exceptional. She served as director of the Hillel of the University of Southern California and as executive director of the Pacific region of the American Jewish Congress. And she was the first woman selected through a national search to lead a major metropolitan synagogue. She is the Rabbi Emerita of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills, California. And in 2017, she was named by PBS's Next Avenue as one of the 50 influencers in aging.
So Rabbi Geller,
tell us how you got interested in the life stage that led to your writing this book.
So I'm delighted to be able to tell you that, but first I really want to thank the two of you. One of the real blessings of this Jewish Book Council tour is that I got to meet you, and you are clearly the poster children for what it means to get good at getting older. So I really so enjoyed our conversations. I'm very grateful to you. I also want to thank Sierra Loudman and Patty Shalansky. We worked on this together, all of us. This isn't just me coming into your homes and talking. We talked and talked about the best way to make this be an interactive conversation. And I want to thank all of you for the care you put in planning this. And of course, I'd like to thank the Hanukkah Center for Learning and the Lee and Bernard Jaffe Jewish Book Festival for making all of this possible. So with those thank yous, now I'll answer your question. So almost 50 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, there was a revolution taking place in the Jewish world. I wasn't active in creating that revolution, but it's probably part of the reason I ended up going to rabbinical school in 1971. That revolution was energized by the beginning of the Jewish counterculture. And it was captured a few years later by a book modeled after the Whole Earth Catalogue, which was called the Jewish Catalogue, a do-it-yourself kit. So I'm going to hold up the Jewish Catalogue. Some of you may know this book because it was a pretty important book for people of that generation. It empowered that generation of baby boomers, as the introduction said, to take back Judaism from the staid hands of our elders and reshape it for our own times. And then it offered the tools to take responsibility for our own Jewish lives. Some of you may even have used the challah recipe in the Jewish catalog the first time you ever tried to bake challah. Well, the co-author of that book was my late husband, Richard Siegel. I didn't know him then. We got married many years later, but this was an important part of his life. Well, that was the 60s and 70s. And now that some of us are in our 60s and 70s, Rich felt that we needed another do-it-yourself kit to help us navigate the changes that are part of our lives as we grow older. So that's the first origin story of this book. Getting good at getting older, which you already saw. Notice that it looks a little like the Jewish catalog, right? It gives us the same kind of toolkit. And like the Jewish catalog, it gives it to us with a sense of humor. The book includes irreverent cartoons and some photographs, including my favorite, the backside of Maxine Menster's tombstone in Iowa, which is a recipe for cookies. Apparently, every time someone asked her for her cookie recipe, she would say, "Over my dead body." So let me tell you the second reason that Rich and I wrote the book. I was 62, beginning to think about our next stage. And I noticed that a huge percentage of congregants, our next stage, Rich and my next stage, what would we do after retirement? I noticed that a huge percentage of our congregants were boomers and that many were leaving the congregation. That observation led to a listening campaign where we talked to 250 congregants in house meetings in people's homes. And we asked these folks through facilitators, congregants who were trained as facilitators, we asked people how they feel about this stage of life, the stage between maturity, building families and careers, and frail old age. Because it turns out that this is actually a new life stage that didn't exist for our grandparents. As Barry said, we're now living approximately 30 years longer than people were a century ago. But these years are not tacked on to the end of our lives, but in the middle, between midlife and frail old age. Again, it's a whole new life stage. And we asked people, what do you want in those years? Now that more years are added to your life, how do you add more life to your years? What keeps you up at night? What gets you up in the morning? What are your fears? What are your hopes? We learned a whole lot of things. And one of the things that we learned is how hard it is to name this stage. What do you call yourself? Boomer? Well, that's only really technically if you were born between 1946 and 1964. Senior? Some people like that word, some people don't. Retired? The word only works if you actually did work for money. Rewired? Seasoned? Elder? My favorite is a word that was coined by Dr. Laura Carstensen of the Stanford Center on Longevity. She calls this stage of life perennial, still blooming, still fruitful, still beautiful. The important thing for us to know is that it's not just about boomers, because we are creating a new life stage that someday our millennial children and grandchildren will be in. In other words, someday my 30-year-old daughter in Boston is going to be between 60 and 80. What we do now is going to shape the world, and particularly the Jewish world, for them as they move into that stage. And it's also important to notice that this is not a chronological age, but it's a life stage. Some of us are healthy and still very active into our 90s. Others of us wrestle with physical challenges, with illness, with caregiving. Some of us are parents of adult children or grandparents, and some of us are solo agers. Some of us have partners, some of us don't. Some of us have discretionary resources, and some of us worry about financial futures. Some of us struggle with disabilities. We're a very mixed group of people. And at the same time, some of our experiences at this stage of life are quite similar. And that's what we learned in the listening campaign. So people shared their fears, and there were 4 primary fears. The first fear was becoming invisible. Who am I when I'm no longer the senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel? Being isolated. Our social world constricts as we move into this stage. Who are my friends going to be? Being without purpose. What do I do all day? And becoming dependent. God forbid I should ever be dependent, specifically on my children. So people shared questions in this listening campaign. Questions like, how do I navigate changing relationships with older parents? Some of us still have older parents. My mom is 98, living outside of Boston in a continuing care facility. Some of us have millennial children, intimate partners. How do these relationships change? And in particular, our relationship with our friends. How do we nurture long-term connections at this stage of our life? How do we let go of toxic friendships? Now that we know that there's less time ahead than there was behind, do I still want to be involved with people who suck energy from me as opposed to give nurturing support? How do I make new friends at this stage of life? And other questions, does friends move away, kids too? With whom do I want to grow old? In what kinds of settings? Do I want to move to a retirement community? Do I want to move to be near my kids? Do I want to share a house? My husband died. I have a lovely home. Do I want to have folks come and share that house with me? Do I want to age in place? Do I want to stay in my home? And if I do, what do I need to do in my community to make it possible to stay? So these were the kinds of questions that came up. Other questions, how do I deal with illness? My own or that of my friends? It's true that in all of our life span, people deal with illness, but there's no question that there's more of it as we move into this stage. What do I need to do to get ready for the inevitable? Those end of life conversations that we know we should have. How do I have them with my adult kids? And if I don't have kids, with whom do I have them? All of these questions kept coming up. What will give meaning to my life now that I no longer work full time? How can I find a position to volunteer or a paid position to which I can bring my experience, my talent, and my passion? I still have a lot to give. How do I give it? And then this question comes up as I meet Barry and Lois. What do I have to do now? I'm 70 years old. What do I have to do now to become the 85-year-old, the 91-year-old that I someday hope to be? What work do I need to do on myself? And how can Jewish wisdom and spiritual practice help me do that? And finally, questions about legacy. What really is going to live on after me? So all of these questions came up in this listening campaign, and those questions became the table of contents for the book. The first section, getting good at gaining wisdom. The second, getting good at getting along, changing relationships. The third, getting good at getting better. How do I take care of myself now so that I can be that 91-year-old that I hope to be? How do I get good at getting ready? What do I have to start doing now in recognition that life is finite? Getting good at giving back. How can I give back the blessings that I have been privileged to receive? And getting good at giving away. What lives on after me? So that became the table of contents of the book. And you'll see when you get the book that each section offers actual tools and resources that will help you find your own answer to those questions. So now I want to send it back to you, Barry and Lois. You really are role models for what it means to get good at getting older. Can you share with us a little bit about what your advice is?
Yes, we would.
We're unmuted.
Okay, here we go. First of all, start early in life. I'm an exercise freak and have been in exercise classes for 40 years and still am. It's really important, first of all, to be healthy. Keep your body as healthy as you possibly can so that you can move when you're 91 years old. I see people in my exercise class who are in their 90s who never exercised before and they can hardly move. But if you get to it gradually, you will be able to move. The other thing is you can never start too early to prepare for retirement. You need to think about your finances and remember that you need to put money away so you'll have it when you do retire. Um, I think the first thing you need to do today is to buy Rabbi Geller's book, and you need to read it and refer to it often. She has such wonderful suggestions, and there are options. No two people are alike. And what might suit you might not suit the next people. So we decided very early to do a lot of volunteering. We've been married 68 years, and we do many things together. And I'll let Barry tell you about some of them.
Well, first of all, having been a pediatric dentist, I've spent my entire life, both professionally and even before that, working with children. So most of the, or many of the things that we have done in the way of volunteering has been in that vein, working with young people. We started a group of teenagers who we sent to Israel for a summer. We created a mixed group of African American and Jewish teenagers who spent a year together studying one another's cultures and histories, and then traveled to the civil rights shrines of the South and to New York. We've worked with the BEAR program, and we created a homework club at the Granby Elementary School. We taught Sunday school. We directed the Sunday school. So we've actually been fortunate enough to be healthy almost all our lives, and started out early being volunteers. There's no problem finding something to do as a volunteer. People are always looking for folks who are willing to work. We're members of numbers of organizations, and they're always asking us, do you know somebody else who'd like to help us out? One of the interesting things we've done over the last several years is Lois and our daughter Wendy and I have been serving lunch every other week to folks who are having chemotherapy at the cancer center. It's a very rewarding experience. You make people feel good, and they make you feel good because of their attitude towards their illness. Not everybody's as fortunate as we are to have been together all these years. We've worked together in my practice. Lois was my office manager for over 30 years, and we still talk to each other when we got home at night. So we have an advantage perhaps over others, but we see people who are both active and people who are inactive, and you can tell the difference. It's very obvious. We now live in a senior adult community, independent living. It was a choice that was difficult for us to make. We had thought about doing it earlier in our retirement life, and thought it would be seeing those older folks would drag us down. But once we made the decision, based on a lot of factors, we have found it to be a very rewarding experience. We've met a lot of new folks who have come from varied backgrounds, professionally, religiously, racially, and it's opened up a new avenue of relationships for us. So that's something it would be good to think about, especially if you're alone, because we have a lot of widows who live in our community, and it makes life much more pleasant for them. Um, I could go on forever, but I don't think that's appropriate. So we don't put ourselves up as experts on aging, but we do say that you can be happy if you take the make an effort to prepare yourself in advance. So now, Rabbi, you wrote the book before the pandemic, and the pandemic has certainly affected every human being in the United States. So, how does this pandemic impact this life stage? How would you, how does your, uh, how would your book be different if you wrote it now instead of when you did write it?
Very good question. But I do want to say, how would my book be different if I had met you before I wrote the book? And that's sad I am that Rich never had the opportunity to meet you because he would have loved you. But what you just taught us is really, I think, so important that first of all, we need to plan, right? We plan for lots of other things in our life. We really need to plan for what this stage is going to be. And we need to start planning before we turn 60. We need to know that our life will unfold in different kinds of stages and we need to plan. The second thing you taught us is that we are embodied human beings, spirits, souls embodied, and we need to take care of our bodies. Something that Jewish tradition doesn't really emphasize or didn't emphasize as strongly as it needs to, and that's a very important, almost spiritual practice to take seriously that we are embodied human beings and we take care of our bodies. And finally, the notion of giving back. It turns out what you know from your own experience, research shows over and over again that people who are involved with younger generations have much higher levels of happiness and actually live longer. And so, actually finding the right way of connecting to the future generations is a part of what it means to get good at getting older. So, I wish Rich had known you and that I had met you before I wrote the book.
Thanks.
As to say, the book was published a year ago, but honestly, that was a lifetime ago, before the plague, before people in our age cohort were afraid that we wouldn't have the opportunity to get good at getting older. The world has completely changed. And yet the issues the book deals with are more relevant than ever. So, ironically, because of the pandemic, all the issues that are part of our lives are actually more urgent. First is the issue of ageism, not just institutionalized ageism, that the only acceptable ism left in our society is ageism. Good people make negative stereotypes, jokes about older people. Those Hallmark cards. The vision of growing older as only one of decline is a real problem for us and for our world. But it's not just institutional ageism, how hard it is for active older adults to get jobs, for example. But more important, or at least equally important, I think, is internalized ageism, the negative stereotypes that we have of ourselves. You all know that people say 70 is the new 50. The truth is that that's just a way of being in denial. It's a way of saying we're not really getting older. But all of a sudden, now, even those of us who denied that we were getting older, well, we can't deny it anymore because it's actually a frightening time to be an older adult. Frightening because people over 60, as we all know, are particularly vulnerable. And the other thing is the response to the pandemic, especially at the beginning, but still in the discourse now, reveals that stereotypes and ageist attitudes about boomers and about aging persist and in some ways have gotten worse. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a meme that trended on social media called hashtag boomer removal. a morbid attitude among some that the deaths of active older adults doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the people that are dying are old ones. People actually were talking like that. And we still see some of that conversation going on in the question of, access to vaccines. And yet, at this very same time, this is a new intergenerational moment. So on the one hand, there's tension between the generations, but on the other hand, the higher vulnerability of those of us over 60 to the virus has confronted our adult children with perhaps their first serious encounter with the health challenges that their parents and grandparents face. And until now, as I suggested before, many boomers' efforts to stay and act young delayed the arrival of concerns about health and slowing down. And now our children worry about us and they fear the possibility of carrying the virus to us, even if they have no symptoms. So we're beginning to be able to have conversations that we didn't have before, as some of us are acknowledging our own internalized ageism. We're beginning to admit that we might need help, right? I couldn't have survived the beginning of the pandemic if my stepdaughter didn't go shopping for me when I wasn't going shopping, right? I needed her help. Until then, she needed my help, but now we were in a very different kind of relationship with each other. And there are important conversations that we should be having with our adult children, as all of us in some way confront the reality of mortality in a way that we didn't want to before. At the same time, many adult children have moved back to their parents' homes, sometimes bringing grandchildren with them. So the value and possibility of intergenerational connections have never been more clear. As Jews, we often think about intergenerational connections as lador vador, from generation to generation. But now I think we realize that the way we ought to be thinking about it is dor vador, generations with generations. And my question to all of us to think about is how can we capitalize on that new reality to imagine different kinds of multi-generational possibilities after the pandemic is over. A third issue that has really emerged more and more because of the pandemic is the increased focus on loneliness and isolation in our age cohort, which is only made worse by sheltering at home. It's important for us to know that before there was COVID, there was another public health crisis, an epidemic. And that was the epidemic of loneliness. Other countries have acknowledged that. The United Kingdom has a minister of loneliness. This was before the pandemic. Somebody whose job it is to think about social policy and how we can change this epidemic of loneliness by creative use of social policy. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was the former U.S. Surgeon General and now is part of President Biden's team, said a long time before the pandemic, loneliness and social isolation are associated with a reduction in lifespan similar to that of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity. And that was before the pandemic. So these are all issues that the pandemic has lifted up for us. And if I were writing the book now, I would pay much more attention to each one of those issues. And actually one more, and that is the issue of technology. We all know now how critical it is that we become those of us who are not digital natives, those of us who, need help getting on Zoom calls, we couldn't have survived this without technology. How do we use technology now? And when the pandemic is over, how will we continue to use technology? One of the things that we've learned is these Zoom calls, they're not perfect, but they're better than nothing. And what's going to happen when we can get back to some kind of new normal? What is a hybrid going to look like between face-to-face meeting and also the use of technology? So those are issues that I would have wanted to deal with more. Our institutions are going to change completely. And how we think about it together as a community is really important. um, so that's how the book would have been different if I were writing it now.
So, Rabbi Gelly, you talk in your book about talking about what you don't want to talk about. How do you do that?
So when we did the listening campaign at Temple Emmanuel, it was clear that the majority of congregants had end of life directives. Those end of life directives were tucked away in a safe deposit box. Doctors had them, lawyers had them, but very few, a very small percentage, had ever really talked about that with their adult children. And I, as a rabbi, have spent far too many hours in hospital rooms where a beloved mom or dad, or even a not so beloved mom or dad, was no longer able to articulate his or her concerns, and adult children were fighting with each other about what was best for mom or dad. And that often led to really terrible toxicity in the family that could so easily have been prevented if there had been a conversation between my generation and our kids. So I'm just going to ask this of Sierra. You are of the generation of my children. How does that resonate with you? Have you had those conversations with the older adults in your life that you know you should be having them with?
I mean, the short answer is I've tried. So I have, my parents are divorced. My dad is remarried, and they both, my mom and my dad, have two very different retirements ahead of them. My mom is not going to be financially able to retire. We know that, and we not just we know that a lot of her not end of life, but just her old age care is going to be part of our responsibility. Not just that we know that, but we're okay with that. She was a single mom for a very long time, and my brothers and I want to give that to her. My dad is on the opposite end, where he is able to financially set up his life so that he can think about retiring, early. Actually, he's technically still working very much full time, but doesn't have to. So he's working for the love of it. Um, and so I've had conversations with both of them. I would love your advice on how to make them a little bit more productive. For my mom, when we try to talk about anything other than the present, she gets very worried about being a burden on us, a time burden, a financial burden. And she starts to, I think, feel really guilty about things that she maybe did or did not do to lead up to her 60s that could end up impacting me and my brothers. And we try to reassure her that we're okay with this, but I think that it's still hard for her to have that conversation. My dad, on the other hand, if I try to have the conversation with him, his attitude is very much like, you don't have to worry about, I mean, I guess it's kind of the same, it's the burden, but like, you don't have to worry about it. I got it handled. Don't worry. I took care of it. I took care of everything. Don't worry. So I'm like, okay, well, I would like to know, that you're talking about the advance directive, if you're talking about what your wishes are, like what is the 5 wishes document? Is that what that is? And he's like, well, we don't have to talk about that now. So any advice that you have for having those types of conversations, or even for the people on this call who maybe are going to feel the same way about having those conversations with their children, how do we get past those hurdles?
So this is so important. I just saw in the chat that people are having some difficulty hearing me. Jake, is that something that you can fix? Is that a problem for people?
They should be able to hear you. I'm hearing you quite clearly, and you're coming through fairly loud. But I'll message them privately and make sure that we can make sure that their system is loud enough for them.
Okay, good. So this is really an important issue, and it is, you are just one of many people who could report what you have just reported. So the first thing is for us to acknowledge that this is very difficult. The book actually, as I said, is a toolkit, and there's a section called Talking About Life and Death, which was not written by me or by Rich, but was written by the people that have created the Conversation Project. The Conversation Project is a national effort to help people across the country. It's not Jewish, it's a secular effort to get people to have these conversations. And it begins with particular stories of the people that created the project, and then it actually gives you specific direction about what you need to, how you could go about getting that conversation to happen. It asks you to think about what gets in the way, who's afraid to have the conversation, so that you're clear about it, and then steps. Figure out what you want to say. Write it down. Explore the challenging idea of being at the end of your life. Consider yours and your loved ones' roles in your medical decision making. Have the conversation. Mom, there'll come a time, God forbid, but there'll come a time, who do you want to be in charge? Who's going to make those decisions? One of the things that's important for those of us who have siblings is, you do the thing that you do best. So my brother lives in Boston. My mom is in Boston. He's in charge of her finances. Who should be in charge of her medical decisions? These are conversations between us and our parents and among the siblings. So, Sarah, I don't know if you have brothers or sisters, but it isn't just you
Two brothers
and your dad. It's you and your brothers and your mom and your dad. But maybe the conversation starts with you and your brothers, and you figure out a plan together about how to move forward. And then you need to set aside the right time to do it. I wouldn't recommend the Passover Seder. I wouldn't recommend Thanksgiving. Is there a time that you could set aside to do it? You need to anticipate the difficulties, and there are tools that can help you do it. There are a tool called 5 Wishes, which actually asks specific kind of questions. There's a wonderful book by Roz Chase, the New Yorker cartoonist, that's called Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? You could give that very funny book to your parents and have that be a kickoff of the conversation. I mean, the bottom line is, as far as we know, the death rate is holding steady at 100%, right? It's not a question of if I'm going to die, it's a question of when I'm going to die. And we prepare for everything in our life. You have a kid, you have a bar mitzvah, you prepare for it. In my synagogue, you have to decide in 4th grade when you want to have the bar mitzvah, right? You plan a wedding, not during the pandemic, but you start planning that. You plan for everything. The one thing that we don't plan for is our funerals, our end of life. And yet it is a very important transition that will have huge implications for the people you leave behind. And so really an act of love is to get over these difficulties and to be able to have this conversation with your adult children, and for adult children to let their parents know that this is an act of love as well. So again, the book is not a sermon. It doesn't say have the conversations. It tells you exactly how to have the conversation.
I have a question that it was actually Anita asked the question in the chat, and I'm going to ask it from my perspective up instead of the other way back because it works for me too. So my parents both live in Pittsburgh. I moved down here a year and a half ago, and my mom is considering moving down with me. My brothers live in DC. One lives in Pittsburgh, but the one who lives in Pittsburgh is very young. He's in his 20s, and he's not anywhere close, and he just may never be the kind of person to really take the lead on that. So the question from Anita is, what do you do if deciding between living in the community where you've raised your children, you've been for decades, versus traveling to be with your children, whether that's across the country or just a little further south? So my mom, to move here, she would be leaving Pittsburgh, where she has lived for 60 years. That's where she has 4 sisters, she has friends, that's where she raised her children. And so how do you weigh being closer to your family, your children, your grandchildren, and staying in the community that you know and love?
So again, everybody is different. There's not one answer to everyone. And I do think that it's very, very important to emphasize what Lois and Barry say, at least in my fantasy. It's a lot easier if you have a partner, right? I'm a widow now, right? I'm alone. My kids are in Boston, in Portland, Oregon. I'm in Los Angeles. I have a stepdaughter here. You know, where is home now? And honestly, during the pandemic, to be so far from my own children has been really painful. I've been, I mean, that is something that all of us know. With whom do I actually even make that decision? If I'm, you know, but the important thing, as Lois and Barry says, is to really think about it and plan. This is not a decision that you should make on the spur of the moment, right? You need to kind of think through what the options are. You need to talk to your friends about it. What kinds of um, uh, decisions are other people making? And one of the things that was a surprise in learning, in writing the book, is how important friends are at this stage of our life. Yeah. It turns out that in 1993, Betty Friedan, 100th birthday coming up in a couple of weeks, she wrote a book called The Fountain of Age. In it, she wrote, this is 1993, this was like the first of the books that began to deal with this issue of getting older. She wrote, more and more, psychologists have found that for older persons, loneliness is not necessarily linked to the death of a spouse or to how infrequently they see their children or grandchildren, but to the absence of personal relationships with peers, friends of their own age or any age, who share their interests and with whom they sustain their roots of shared experience. So think about that in your own lives, you know, the importance of friends. And if you have lived in Pittsburgh your whole life, and if you have a rich community, a rich meaning a, you know, an engaged community and people that will be there for you when you need them, that's really an important thing. Sometimes when we move to be near our kids, the kids are busy with their own lives, right? And it is difficult when we get older to make new friends when we move into a new community. So all of that is something to think about. And maybe it's possible to experiment. I mean, some people suggest that we should look at this stage of our life as a kind of gap year where you try things out and see what works. So, you know, now between high school and college, some young people are taking a year off and then they go off to college. Well, what if we took a gap year in making permanent decisions? And if you're in the financial position to do it, to move from Pittsburgh for 6 months to be near a adult child and see what it feels like with still maintaining the opportunity to come back to Pittsburgh. You know, I think we need to be creative about this because, again, we are the first generation that's really dealing with this whole constellation of issues. And we need to be kind of courageous and curious about how we go about making decisions like that. So I don't know if that really answers a question, but you know, I think it's stuff for us to talk about. And by the way, all of you on this call, get a group of you together and talk about it. You know, have your own listening campaign. What decisions are you making and how are you weighing it? And how do your kids, if you have them, weigh into these kinds of schedule now? Yeah. So that would be my advice.
Thank you, Rabbi Geller. I believe that Barry and Lois have another question for you before we open it up for questions from the audience. If you have any questions for Rabbi Geller, please prepare them by putting them into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Go ahead, Barry and Lois. It's all you.
So, Rabbi, you know, for Lois and I, we've been involved in Jewish life for a long time, most of our married life for sure. And it's played a major role in making life more pleasant for us during this pandemic. because we have been Zooming services twice a day, and we get to meet and see 15 or 20 of our, now some of them have become really good friends on a daily basis. But we wonder how you can, how your book helps to talk a bit about creating new Jewish rituals for some folks who really haven't been as involved as we were in Jewish life.
So this is, I think, for me, this is a really interesting question. I have been interested in the question of ritual since the beginning of my engagement with Jewish tradition. Remember, I was one of the early women to become rabbis, and in my life, there have been important moments that Jewish tradition didn't pay attention to. When you think about Judaism and life cycle rituals, life cycle ritual is when you pass from one stage of life to another. Most of our life cycle rituals are clustered around the beginning of our lives, right? A baby is born and that baby has a bris. And since the 1970s, if the baby is a girl, there's a covenant ceremony. When I first, I didn't have that when I was a girl because girls didn't have that. My brothers had brises, obviously, but I didn't. There was no covenant ceremony when I was born, right? Then there is, for some people, a pidyon haben, a redemption of the firstborn son, or in the Reform community, sometimes a redemption of the firstborn child. Then there is a bar or bat mitzvah. And again, the first bat mitzvah didn't happen until 1923. I mean, the tradition has changed and created new rituals for women. After the bar or bat mitzvah comes confirmation, and after confirmation comes marriage, and in some cases divorce, right? And after marriage and divorce, what is the next life cycle ritual that Judaism offers us? It's a funeral, right?
Right.
Ironically, I will, God willing, live more years between my first marriage and my funeral than between when I was born and when I first got married. How is it possible that our tradition, which believes that divinity, however you understand divinity, is present at every moment in our lives, what is not present in this stage of our life? How do we mark the truth of our own experience that there are moments at this stage in our lives that deserve to be marked? Our tradition tells us that we're supposed to say 100 blessings a day. What does that mean, 100 blessings a day? It means 100 times a day you stop and you say, wow. Before you eat, you look at this apple and you think, wow. And there's a blessing for that, right? There's as Elizabeth Warren said, that I have a plan for that. There's a blessing 100 times a day. You see a friend you haven't seen for a long time, there's a blessing. You see the ocean you haven't seen, you say a blessing. You come out of the bathroom and your body is working well, you say a blessing. There's a blessing for 100 times a day, right? What about at this stage of our life? What are those blessings? And what are the life cycle rituals? What are the moments? So what the book tries to do is to say, pay attention to this. What are those moments in our lives that we want to mark? Basically what Jewish feminism taught Judaism is my experience as a Jewish woman is Jewish experience. Whether the ancient rabbis understood that or not, it's not relevant. It is Jewish experience. Our experience as active older adults is Jewish experience. Whether there are rituals for it or not, we get to make them up. So what the book doesn't tell you how to do it, but it asks you to think about what are those moments in your life at this stage in your life that you would want to mark, and then imagine how you would do it. So I'm just going to read a very, very short piece from the book. It's called Farewell Family Home. Saying goodbye to the house where you raised your children isn't easy, but it's easier if you actually say goodbye. Our daughter, her boyfriend, my husband, and I walked through the rooms of our home, stopping in each one to share good memories, and to honor the room for its
So
service.
she's actually talking about this.
After our journey through time, space, and love, we shed a few tears, toasted the house, and sent it on its way to shelter and protect a new family. Before this ritual, we were stuck, painfully holding on to the house we had built 27 years before when our daughter was born. But after the ritual, we felt joy and contentment as we realized how rich those years had been and how ready we were to let go and move on. An unforeseen benefit is that our daughter's boyfriend now feels more connected to the life and history of our family and says he can't wait to be part of the new memories we make together in our condo. We can't wait either. And subsequent to writing the book, a new memory was made in that very condo when that boyfriend and girlfriend became bride and groom in that condo, and the only people that were present were me, the rabbi, the bride and groom, and the parents. We stood 6 feet apart, all of us wearing masks. A new memory in that condo. But that's an example. What are the moments? A major birthday. Some of us know there's a tradition that when you're 83, you have a second bar or bat mitzvah. Why? Because the psalmist tells us that you live, a full life living to be 70. So if you make it to 83, it's like you're 13 again. So it's a time for that kind of a celebration. But what about when you turn 70 or when you turn 80 or when you turn 90? How do you mark that? With whom do you mark it? Who is the audience for it? Stopping full-time work. We think about retirement as a secular experience, but it's actually quite a spiritual moment because it marks the beginning of a very new stage. How do you think about that? Becoming a grandparent. If you become a grandparent and you live in LA, but your kids are in Portland, how does your life change here, even though the grandchildren, it's still a major change. How do I mark that? With what friends? Who is the community? A big issue out here, I don't know if it's an issue for you, is giving up the car keys. It's a very important moment, and particularly in a community like this where driving is so important. And it's experienced as loss. People don't want to do it because they don't want to admit that they're getting older and it's not safe to drive anymore. And so people fight it, there's tension around it. What if we were to create a ritual within the Jewish community, at a JCC and a synagogue, where people who are wise enough to know when it's time to give up the keys are honored in some kind of way, that's a sign of wisdom, not a sign of loss. And if we did it in a communal way, if a synagogue did it, if a JCC did it, then that synagogue or JCC would be have responsibility to help people still be able to get around, right? If I can't drive anymore and I've been honored by my synagogue as a person of wisdom, the synagogue needs to help me figure out how to get to shul, right? I mean, what would that lead to in terms of our communities helping us with these transitions in our life? So thinking about ritual matters because it tells us what's important and it helps us frame both the loss and the opportunity at this stage of our life by paying attention in a different kind of way. So I think that ritual is a very important piece of what we might want to be exploring together. Barry and Lois, you're muted.
We're unmuting. Okay. Rabbi, one last thing, it seems appropriate, is what did your book say about leaving a legacy?
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left, and this is really a big issue, but I have one piece of bad news for all of you. Everything else I frame as opportunity. The one bad piece of news is our kids don't want our stuff.
Right.
And how we think about that, becomes really very important. And if we had more time, and we don't, we could have a whole conversation about how to think about giving away. And of the things that we would want to talk about is how we think about giving away money, whether we are rich or not rich. Jews give away money. We give tzedakah. How do you think about that? What is the plan that you have? What do you want your money to do? What are the values that come through how you leave your money? Stuff. How you think about stuff. Um, very quickly, I have the one thing I have from my grandmother is this very beautiful antique hutch that was, I remember it when I was a little girl from her house in Boston. When I moved out here, it got schlepped across the country. It's beautiful. My kids don't want it. What do I do with it? I'm not going to leave it on the street and have somebody pick it up. As I think about this hutch, it isn't actually the hutch that matters to me. It's my grandmother. And what I really want my children to have isn't the hutch if they don't want it. I want somebody who really loves that hutch to have it. What I want my children to have is understanding why my grandmother was important to me. So what I want to do with that hutch is take a photograph of it and tell the story about what it means to me to have that and what my grandmother means to me. And my kids can have the photograph and the story, and then some other person who will love the hutch will have the hutch. I mean, so thinking about our things in that different kind of way, I think is important. Stories. How much would you have loved knowing more about your parents and grandparents? So how do we tell those stories? Do we make a video? The book deals with all of this. And finally, there's a section on how to write an ethical will, how to actually think out loud about the values that you want to actually put in writing or in other kind of technology so that your kids, your grandkids, or other people, again, we don't all have kids and grandkids, to whom do we want to imagine leaving a legacy? How do we leave a legacy in the communities in which we live? So those are all questions that are important and deserve much more time than the few minutes that we have left. I would like to just ask Sierra, your title is that you are involved in Jewish innovation. What does Jewish innovation have to do with all of us?
Well, when I first started my position here as the director of Jewish innovation, I was thinking to myself, like, do I have to be super innovative? Like, do I have to be the one that has all of these ideas and is doing all of that innovative work? And I realized that I was new to the community, and sure, I can have my ideas, but the innovators are already here. The people who have done the innovating, the people who are still innovating and have those ideas are already here. So having those conversations with all of you and others in the community are really what's going to be giving me the best opportunity to do my job and do it well. So there are a few ways that I can think of that you all can get involved with Jewish innovation. The first is that just being involved in programs such as this one, like Lois and Barry were today, your experience and the time that you've spent in our community, your professional experience, your personal experience makes you the experts to be the ones who are introducing our speakers, who are engaging these conversations, even being a part of an expert panel discussion. And so if you have something that you would like to share with the community, please let me know. I'm more than happy to connect you with the right program for you. The other thing is our Melton School. So our Melton School is a school for adult Jewish learning. And you can join that either as a learner or apply to become a part of our faculty and actually teach one of our courses. And then we do have a Jewish Innovation Steering Committee, and there are some subcommittees within that we'd love to hear your voices. So one of my favorite things in the chat right now is that I'm not just collecting questions, I'm also collecting some wonderful comments and ideas. And these types of things are things that we can bring back to our steering committee. So if anybody would like to be involved in those types of conversations. Right now, my office is at home, so I can't say my door is open because literally, please don't come in here. The door is closed. But my virtual door is open. You're always welcome to email me, and my colleague Patty Shalansky is going to put my email into the chat. And speaking of Patty is our Arts and Ideas Manager. And so if you're interested in the arts, there are plenty of opportunities in our book festival and our film festival, Israel Fest, and I'm sure that Patty would be happy to connect with you on all of those. So her email and my email will be in the chat for you, and I welcome you all to contact us. And then I guess Rabbi Geller, we don't have a ton of time, but I do have a couple of questions for you that I got out of the chat that I would like to ask you. The first is, do you have some advice for handling ageist attitudes in the personal, social, and institutional realms?
So again, this is really complicated because if we don't deal with our own internalized ageism, we're not going to be able to deal with the institutional ageism. So first we have to deal with our own negative images of ourselves. And I think there's a lot of work we can do together by talking about that. A wise aging group in the community where people can actually talk about what it feels like to get older. And there's a wonderful article in the book by Nessa Rappaport called Regarding My Body, where she talks about how it feels to have a body that is growing older when our vision of ourselves in our heads is when we were in our 20s. How do we deal with those kinds of changes? So we have to start with ourselves. I said that to say 70 is the new 50 is just about denial. The truth is, and by the way, the bottom line of the book is 70 is not the new 50, 70 is the new 70. And how we do that really matters. So how we think about ourselves growing older will have some impact on how the world thinks about growing older. I mean, it is ironic that a lot of the people leading our country now are people who are active older adults, right? So anybody who is, wants to, think that active older adults are not important. Just look at Dr. Fauci. Just look at our new president. I mean, so maybe, I don't know if this is going to happen, but maybe some of those stereotypes will change. But I think that we need to be vigilant. Just like everybody on this call, when somebody says a racist thing, you would call them out on that. When somebody says an anti-Semitic thing, you would call them out on that. When someone says an ageist thing, you need to call them out on that. And it's when we work together. I mean, you remember the Gray Panthers when we were younger? We need that kind of activism now. And frankly, the AARP is doing some really wonderful work around this. There are a lot of us. I mean, we are, there are now more people who are over 60 than under 18. I mean, the demographics of our country really are changing. We need to speak up and not allow the kind of ageist attitudes to go unchallenged. I think that that's the beginning of change. So that's, a quick answer to that very, very important question.
Thank you. And I feel badly not addressing some of the other questions in here, but Rabbi Geller, you said something about if we had more time, we'd be able to have a bigger conversation about what you leave behind. So I want to just say that I very much hope this will not be the last time that we have you to our community, and I hope that next time you'll be able to be here in person. And maybe we can do some of those workshops, and we can address some of these questions then, but we can also we'll send out a follow-up email, and we can include some of your answers to questions there if you and I have a chance to discuss them beforehand.
Right, and I really want to underscore what you just said, right? I wrote this book, but I'm not an expert. I'm making it up as I go along, just as you are making it up as you go along. And if we can do that together, then this new way of being in this stage of life will change. The kinds of questions that are asked: how do you deal with a grown-up child who doesn't want to deal with the possibility that you someday are going to die? That's a really important question. And whoever asked the question, other people on this call have exactly the same question. So take Sierra up on her offer, and put a group together, and begin to talk about it and think about it. And then when that, millennial child knows that you're in a group talking about the problems that people in our generation have because our kids don't want to deal with the truth of our mortality, it's become something that you can talk to. And anyway, so you have the answers in your community, and you have wonderful staff people, and you have wonderful role models. Really, I do a lot of talking around the country. This community that you guys are in, you're very lucky to be there, and use it, and make the kind of change. Be, as that wonderful poet said at the inauguration, if we can see it, then we can be it. Well, the way that you see it is by talking to each other and imagining it. And I have every hope that I will come and see all the things that you have become by sharing these conversations with each other. So with that, I would want to just leave you with a quick little word of Torah, and that is to remind you that Thursday is Tu B'Shvat, Tu, which is the Hebrew acronym for 15, or it's one of the ways to say 15. The 15th day of the month of Shvat that we're in, which is a new year of the trees. The day, according to tradition, that the sap begins to flow in trees again. It's sort of the beginning of spring coming, although it's not technically the beginning of spring. It's also understood in the mystical tradition as the new year of the tree of life, which is understood by the mystics as a tree with the roots in heaven, the trunk that links heaven and earth, and the branches that go out and connect each one of us to every other living thing. The sap begins to flow on Tu B'Shvat, the channel between the upper realms and the low, whatever it is, divinity, that, we are connected to each other through this life force. Thursday, Tu B'Shvat, that's the day it begins again. And I wanted to just remind you of a famous story. You all know about it. Honi, the miracle worker, sees this old man planting a tree, an almond tree. It's not going to blossom for 70 years. He says to the old man, "Old man, why are you doing this? You're not going to get to eat the fruit of this tree." And the man responds, "I came into this world. There were almond trees planted by my ancestors. I plant these trees for those that come after me." 70 is the new 70. The trees that you all are planting by the way you embrace this new stage of your life is a gift that you are giving to generations that come after you. So take seriously the blessing of being able to give this gift and keep planting seeds. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to take a second and just thank Rabbi Geller and Barry and Lois Einhorn, not just for today, but for all the conversations that we had leading up to this event. And thank you, everybody who attended today. If you're interested in more of these intergenerational conversations, please join us on Wednesday at noon for our Israel Today presentation of Israel Story with Shlomo Maitel, who will be having a conversation with his son Yochai. And I'm going to put the link for that in the chat so you can find it there. It will also be in our follow-up email. And with that, I thank you all. And Barry and Lois, I see that you're unmuted. Would you like to say goodbye?
Yes, it's been a real pleasure, certainly. Thank you for inviting us to be part of this wonderful program.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day.